We're recording now. Thank you.
Okay. Let's do a little final adjustment of my screen. There we go. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning, Planning and Collaboration for LBS Virtual Delivery. We'll do some housekeeping items and some introductions, but just want to thank you very much for setting aside some time this morning to be here with us, to perhaps share some of your thoughts and collaborate with your colleagues around the province. If you scroll through the chat, depending on when you logged in, you can see we've got, again, people from all over the province, which is wonderful. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the previous webinars in this series, but I just wanted to point out today that the webinar that you're now participating in is a joint effort on the part of 4 of our LBS support organizations and or literacy networks. The College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading, which is who I represent, the Quill Learning Network, and Heather Robinette is on the line today as a co-presenter. We have Literacy Link South Central. Tamara Cottery is the ED of LLSC. And of course, Contact North, and many of you know Sarah Stalker, who is with us today as well. So we have collectively worked together over this past number of months to bring you this short webinar series, of which today is the 3rd. My name is Barb Glass. I'm the ED of the College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading, which is the provincial LBS support organization for the college sector LBS programs. We do some other things in the CSC as well. We also hold the service provider agreement to deliver one of the LBS e-channel programs called ACE Distance, and a number of other things that as many support orgs do. Heather Robinette is my co-presenter today. She's going to help keep an eye on the chat. She's going to jump in if I forget some things or if she wants to supplement some of the information that we're talking about. And she'll also be fielding some questions throughout. So Heather, thanks for being here today. And then of course, as I mentioned, our supporting cast, Tamara and Sarah. We do always like to, in our webinars, acknowledge that we are coming from many places in the province and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And while we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to take a minute to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations.
All we can do is try.
And to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Métis, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So a little outline for today. And as I alluded to a moment ago, please do feel welcome to ask questions as we go along. This is sort of a formal but informal session, and it is often easier to address questions when they come up. So you can type into the chat, you can raise your hand, and between Heather and I, we'll be able to monitor both of those. We will have, of course, a wrap-up Q&A at the end, but we will welcome questions as we go along. So we have a little bit of background to cover in terms of the previous webinars in this series, a short discussion of some terminology around online and remote learning. The 3rd item is just an overview of the current online programs in LBS, the LBS e-channel programs. And the bulk of today's discussion really falls around number 4 and some considerations for ongoing virtual delivery if that is something that your program, your board, your school board, your college, your constituents and stakeholders wish to engage in. And then we'd like to also provide you with a resource, which will be posted along with the webinar when it's finished. And it's really had many evolutions. We started out thinking it would be nice to provide some kind of something concrete as a resource from this series of 3 webinars. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that checklist and workbook for planning look like. We'll spend a little bit of time on the topic of blended learners and how that might benefit your program. And then of course, just have a little summary and wrap up. So I don't see any questions yet. And I think we can carry on then. So by way of a little bit of background information, I'd just like to give you an overview of the first two webinars that we engaged in earlier this year in this short series. The overall purpose of the webinar series, as it says in the orange font, is to assist LBS programs in thinking critically about the role of virtual learning, given the nature of their clients, their resources, their in-house expertise, and the rest of the LBS landscape. So when the four partners that I mentioned earlier, CSC, LLSC, Quill, and Contact North, sat down and really started to talk about this last spring, to be honest, we weren't exactly sure where we would go with this. We just felt that it was important to give a voice to some pieces of this discussion in a broader venue than perhaps just within a program or even just within an LSP. So hence these webinars were born. The first one was June 18th, and it was entitled LBS Virtual Delivery in Community-Based Agencies. Where do we go from here? Second one was Digital Learning in My LBS Program, Here to Stay. And then today we're following up with planning and collaboration for virtual LBS delivery. So we hope that the three have been a fairly coherent set of webinars and discussions. So just to recap a little bit about the very first one, although it was primarily targeted at community-based agencies, we certainly did have some other sectoral providers, school boards and colleges on the line that day. And most of the discussion was focused around, to what extent would you like to re-engage learners in face-to-face? To what extent would you like to continue delivering some virtual programming? What are some of the pluses, the minuses, the interestings in terms of the features and how that, to use a very tired word, that pivot to remote learning had gone so far as of last June. And Tamara Cottery was the moderator for that session, and she did an excellent job. And it really turned out to be a bit of almost like a phone-in show, we thought. And people were really eager to participate and had some really great discussion to kick off this short series. The second session back in November was delving a little bit further into the difference between going online in an emergency and then doing so in a planned and more deliberate way. We had a couple of guests. We had Kathy Hibbert from Western University and Lana Parker from University of Windsor. And we also had Robin Cook Ritchie, who many of you know in one of her several roles in the LBS world. And a fair bit of that discussion related to the challenges around connectedness and communication strategies and relationships with learners in the virtual environment. And one question that was posed in that webinar is, will I be able to forge relationships with learners in an online space? So a good part of the discussion related to that. Robin talked a little bit about some resources to help understand and access e-channel for blended learning, which we'll touch on again today, because perhaps you didn't have a chance to hear a little bit more about e-channel in previous webinars. So a quick question in the chat from Adam. Adam, currently the first two webinars are posted on YouTube, and we are working on a more permanent place to post both the webinars and any associated resources. So Sarah, did you want to comment any further on that?
Barb, I'm going to put the links to the recordings for the first two webinars into the chat. And we were waiting to have the whole series to create a page for them. But I will also alert everyone on Basecamp when this recording is available and put its link there. But watch in the chat and I'll add the previous recording links. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah. And if you are looking at this afterward in terms of the PowerPoint, I did insert the links, although I can't actually see them on my view. I did insert the links to the webinars, the current links to the YouTube versions on these particular slides. Jill commented the readings from digital learning were excellent. Yeah, there were some pretty interesting articles that went with that one. And so thanks for that comment, Jill. And then something that's developed or come to the forefront a little bit since that November 22nd webinar. And I thought it was worth mentioning today in the spirit of sharing what I think is good news, is that the ministry is currently funding the LBS Digital Capacity Building Project. And it is being co-managed by Alpha Plus, the LBS Digital Support Organization, and Contact North. So Sarah is quite involved in that as well. There is an external consultant who's been engaged to actually conduct most of the work, and that would be Cathexis. Many of you remember Cathexis from the LBS evaluation report that they conducted a few years ago, and it was a very well-received report by the field. The timeline is tight. It's November to March, and I've just listed the two general objectives of the capacity building project on the slide. So to engage and collaborate with the LBS stream sector support organizations, as well as educators, tutors, and learners, to identify gaps and priorities for digital services and tools for learners, educators, and organizations. And that's a lot of what we're talking about today, is some of those variables and services and tools and needs for planning. So I think this dovetails, this project dovetails nicely with this webinar, or vice versa, depending whether it's the chicken or the egg coming first. And then hopefully the second objective, providing a roadmap to enhance the LBS system's capacity to deliver more services remotely and expand blended learning opportunities to serve more learners. So I don't think we'd have too much disagreement in looking at these objectives as a positive step forward for LBS. I think we'll all be very interested in how this shapes, both in terms of the report and perhaps some future digital capacity enhancement in LBS delivery. I feel like my voice is getting a bit raspy, so I apologize if I often take sips of my water. I didn't go get another coffee. I just have water. So take a minute. If you have been delivering virtual programming, I'm assuming almost everybody on the line here today probably has. What would you like to pat yourself on the back about? What are you proud of? What are you happy with? What's been going well? What are some of the positives that you've been experiencing? Just feel free to type into the chat. And you can guess what the next question is. So if you've been having struggles, we'll talk a little bit about that too. Just a way to open up a bit of discussion here at the beginning. Sue says we've been able to keep most of our students learning throughout the pandemic. Right on. And that's a big, big accomplishment, Sue. And Sarah mentions we've been able to tailor the program to some student needs. And I'm just going to enlarge my chat a bit so I can see this a little better. Staff have learned so much about technology. That's Denise's comment. Absolutely. It's been like a PD every day and learning every day. Lori mentioned that they've looked into different available platforms that can be used. Denise also mentions the students are still engaged, and some are probably even more engaged. You know, we've really seen some dichotomies here, some students who were just thrilled to be engaged virtually and others who have seen virtually. And just a quick reminder to please mute yourself if you are if you're not already muted, just so we can avoid any background noise. Kathleen mentions that some learners can actually attend more often than they normally could in the classroom. Yeah, especially if they have kids at home and they are having childcare issues or they are having work schedule issues. Adam mentions offering communication and instruction outside of regular hours. Yes, much more, I think, flex time access has been available. Shannon, we've been able to deliver small group programs and individual training. That's awesome. Jill mentions also synchronous learning using chats, virtual guest speakers. Yeah, a lot easier to get virtual guest speakers sometimes than in-person ones. So that's certainly a bonus. Creativity from Sarah in Google Classroom with resources. Maria mentioned staff were able to pivot to online with no problem. That's amazing, Maria. That's such a positive comment. And we can't keep up with the amount of programming we're asked to do. It's awesome. It is awesome. Carrie, this has worked well for our learners who are working shifts. Absolutely, because again, flexibility is key. So thank you for those comments. And I think it's really important to kick off today's discussion by just acknowledging how hard I think many of us have worked and how we have provided flexibility to our learners, but how our learners have in turn shown us some flexibility and support in what's been, you know, kind of a bit of a roller coaster time, I think. And here we are coming up to the end of the second year. So again, thank you for those comments. And you can imagine what my follow-up question will be. So what are you still struggling with? What would you like to change? What have been some of the roadblocks that just don't seem to go away? However you want to think of those challenges. So again, feel free to type a few things into the chat if you'd like. Jose mentions tech difficulties, in-person contact. Yes. Adam notes that a lot of learners do not possess digital competencies, particularly in our community. Absolutely. Rural internet service. Shannon, I live it. I'm living it today. And I should have said at the beginning, I do live in rural Northern Ontario, and I've had a lot of connection issues for the past few weeks. So if you lose me, it'll probably take me about 5 minutes to get back on, but my partner in crime, Heather, has a copy of the PowerPoint too, and she can step in. So let's hope that I don't experience that today, but I can certainly relate to it. Lack of internet at client homes, says Sarah, yes. Denise mentions with each shutdown, mental health and morale has been waning. And Denise, I would suspect that's true of both learners and sometimes staff too, because many of us have similar challenges to our learners. One person said to me once, the difference is that, we probably have more coping strategies and supports than many of our learners do, whether it's in a pandemic or any other time. Yep, the digital divide, as Lori notes, again, cannot have not have easy access to devices. Yeah, Sue mentions the challenges around the bonding that happens in face-to-face, which is much harder to establish in virtual programming. And we'll talk more about that later. Fewer referrals from OW. Yeah, Maria mentions that. Loaning out Chromebooks. Learners sharing computers with their children. So yeah, this theme of not having access to technology devices and connectivity and or not having digital skills to engage really isn't going away. Interesting comment from Sarah, hard to introduce clients to other community partners for referrals. Absolutely. It's a lot easier when they're sitting there with you in your office or classroom and you can just point them almost physically to a referral partner or to some other service in your organization. Yeah, Adam also alludes to the loss of that personal connection. Yeah, lots of agreement around that. And Nicolette mentions having to provide printers and yeah, there's some substantive costs to that as well and challenges. Much harder to read body language. Yes, Heather, especially in an asynchronous form of delivery where you're never even online with the learners at the same time. So thank you again. Very interesting comments. And Sarah, yes, supporting learners with low digital skills, it does continue to be a challenge. So although these challenges are still significant, there's a little bit of some gratification in knowing that you're not the only one still experiencing them. I would make the assumption based on your answers to the first questions about what things are going well, that many of you would still like to be able to continue delivering virtually in some form, even when face-to-face is more open. And that Doesn't mean exclusively, but in a hybrid model, perhaps. I think there's a lot of support in all the delivery sectors, school board, community-based, and college, to continue with a hybrid model or continue with some virtual learning capacity. And so going back to the ministry's current project on the digital strategy enhancement, I think that we can be hopeful that we will be supported, and I'm not the ministry and I'm not putting words in their mouth, but the fact that they're engaging in this discussion about virtual, enhancing virtual delivery is I think a positive. And yes, Nicolette, very good point. I've heard from many service providers that some students only want face-to-face and they will wait until it's available. Absolutely. And, as an e-channel provider, we see many of the people who only want online. And it was ever thus. There are people that would much prefer to engage virtually, and there's people who would much prefer to engage face-to-face. I think we all know in our LBS programs that sometimes the social support that it provides is really key to our learners' success and viability in the program and why they keep coming. So yeah, I'm just looking quickly back into the chat here. Yeah, it is nice to have the option of both. And Nicolette also mentions the challenges with outside supports being needed for substance abuse, mental health issues, other things like that. And it can be harder to connect people or sometimes to even recognize those challenges delivering virtually. Sue comments the administrative load is much heavier. Yep, staff have had to learn to communicate better without daily face-to-face contact, and that is a challenge, and it's almost an art form. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we're talking about communication strategies. All right, I think I'm caught up in the chat. All right. So by way of just a couple of definitions, I'm going to present to you two definitions: online learning and remote learning. And I will not take credit for them. We had a webinar that was offered through Contact North to the broader Contact North community, many of the post-secondary institutions who also work with Contact North. They have a contact, sorry, I'm garbling my words here. Contact North has a site and a resource called teachonline.ca. And so one of the things that teachonline.ca provides is free webinars around online and distance learning. So earlier this year, Dr. Darcy Hardy conducted a webinar. And so some of today's discussion is centered around parts of what she presented in that webinar. And just to introduce her a little bit, she's from the States. She's currently the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Blackboard. Blackboard, of course, is one of the large learning management system providers in North America and indeed outside of North America. So it's interesting, on her website, she has a quote that I think helps set the tone for today. To successfully organize and implement online education, one must understand technology is only part of the solution. And I think some of your comments in the chat alluded to that. In addition to powerful platforms, a successful program is based on solid strategy, strong policies, quality oversight, administrative support, faculty/practitioner buy-in, an excellent student support infrastructure, and the ability to see the big picture. And I just find it really interesting that many of the things that she notes in this quote are things that came up in our chat a few minutes ago. So on to her definitions to, again, help set a bit of context for today. Here's what we've all experienced. Remote learning in the era of COVID-19 is fast, minimal, and primarily synchronous. It rarely includes any instructional design elements or support. The goal of remote learning is to duplicate as much traditional teaching as possible, complemented with readings and assignments. Training and PD are focused on the use of technology and little, if any, on pedagogy, or we could say andragogy in the world of adult education. The use of discussion boards and other asynchronous interactive activities is limited. Student support structures such as a help desk, online tutoring, etc., may or may not exist. And remote learning doesn't necessarily include an LMS. I feel like we can all relate to that, because that, I think, is a pretty apt description of what's gone on, not just in LBS, but of course in the much, much broader education sector in this last 2 years. Even though some of that emergency remote learning has settled down to something more stable, this is certainly, I think, how it started. So yes, Nicolette, thanks for that question. LMS is learning management system. So things like Blackboard, Desire to Learn, Moodle, Canvas, a number of those examples. So let's take a look now at Darcy Hardy's version or definition of online learning. Online learning is strategic, thoughtful, and deliberate. It involves data-driven processes that evolve around quality in both design and delivery. It includes an ecosystem. I like that word ecosystem in this context, that addresses vision, strategy, governance, faculty, and again, practitioner in our world, development, instructional course design, technology, and student support. It is not haphazard, nor is it dependent upon either synchronous or asynchronous delivery. Courses are not simply repositories for files, and curricula is developed to include highly engaging and interactive elements. Online teaching and learning makes the most of offering programs via the internet. So these two definitions are somewhat the basis for our further discussions today around the differences between virtual/remote learning and deliberate, planned, full-blown online learning. And I'll just pause for a second in case there's any questions or comments around those two definitions. And as you've probably learned over the last couple of years, there's lots of definitions out there for blended, virtual, hybrid, remote, distance, e-learning, online learning. We as the team developing the set of webinars just particularly liked Darcy Hardy's descriptions of these two, remote and online. So let's just briefly talk about true full-blown online learning, if I can call it that, and what it looks like today in LBS. We do have 5 online providers who are known as the LBS e-channel programs. And you've probably seen this logo at different times over the years. Contact North is the support organization for the 5 e-channel programs. And today is not a promo or a marketing strategy for eChannel. It's just helping build some awareness of how eChannel may fit into your organization's plans for virtual and or blended delivery. So many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with the 5 online eChannel providers. ACE Distance is the program that I manage that is largely college sector ACE program delivery. Good Learning Anywhere is the Sue Hudson Literacy Council, and it is funded to serve the Indigenous stream. This logo is a bit small. George Brown delivers Deaf Learn Now for deaf online programming for the deaf and hard of hearing community. The Learning Hub is delivered by the Avon-Maitland District School Board. And so both the ACE Distance program and Avon-Maitland's Learning Hub are Anglophone stream programs. And then, of course, we have Formation à Distance, which is the Francophone e-channel provider. So e-channel is not new. I think possibly Good Learning Anywhere and the Learning Hub were 2 of the first of the 5 to be funded. And this goes way back to 2003, 2004. And ACE Distance came into the fold around 2007-8. And FAD also was one of the early providers, and then Deaf Learn Now was funded, I think, in 2011. So these 5 programs have a very long history of fully online delivery, which lines up fairly closely with the definition of online delivery that we just looked at a few minutes ago. And you can see at the bottom of the slide, eChannel.ca is Contact North's site where everything eChannel is stored. There are links to programming, to resources for students, resources for practitioners, and so on. Last year, the eChannel programs got together and developed a little bit of a one-pager kind of info sheet. And I just took a quick excerpt from it to illustrate some of the scope of eChannel. So we've talked about the 5 organizations. The 5 providers, we serve about 7,000 learners a year. There are, believe it or not, more than 500 courses available through the 5 providers. And we did a little tally and discovered we have about 700 or so years of collective experience when you look at the practitioners and instructors and staff and managers within eChannel. And of course, because we're LBS programs, we serve the same goal paths as you do. And this is just a brief breakdown of roughly the goal path percentages that we see in the eChannel programs. So just an FYI. Toward the end of the presentation, as you might recall from the outline at the beginning, we'll talk a little bit more about blended delivery and how it might be able to help with your face-to-face programming. Tamara has a comment in the chat. I like this infographic. I didn't know there were so many courses available. Yeah, when we started counting them last year, when we made this info sheet, I was even surprised, Tamara, to learn that there are that many different courses. So it speaks to the fact that there's lots of things available. And yes, Heather, lots more being developed as well. So let's move into what I mentioned earlier is kind of the bulk of today's presentation. And we're going to work through the checklist that I mentioned earlier in a slightly modified way. And then after we work through these considerations together and have some discussion, then I'll just show you a brief look at kind of a little screenshot of the workbook, or the checklist in the workbook that will be available if you are interested in using it in the future. So as we developed this webinar, we kind of kept interchanging hybrid and virtual and distance and so on, but we're going to stick to the word virtual, mostly virtual delivery, to mean any programming for your learners that allows them to engage remotely for some component. It might not be all of it, it might be all of it, but at least some of it. But we're making the distinction between virtual delivery and fully online delivery, such as that offered by eChannel. I keep forgetting that I can navigate from my presenter view screen as well. So I'm going to just pause for a minute and reorganize myself just a wee bit. There we go. So some is highlighted here. Here are some of the things that we want to think about or consider today. This is not an exhaustive list. This is some considerations around virtual delivery that we can break down and talk about in a little more detail, each of these 5 categories. You clearly have already thought of some of them. You've already addressed some of them. You've already been challenged by some of them over this past couple of years. Maybe you haven't experienced all of them. So we hope that today will give you some further food for thought, further ideas about considerations if you do want to continue doing more ongoing virtual delivery. So for the next several slides, we're going to take each one of these A, B, C, D, and E's and break it down into some subcategories. And again, do feel free to type something into the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to verbalize a question. So the first item on that list, strategies for virtual delivery. So we're talking about organizational strategies. We're talking about strategies that, you know, for example, if you're a community-based organization, that would likely have to be discussed with your board. If you're in a college, these are broader strategies that would probably have to be discussed outside of your program as well. Same in a school board. So the term strategies is here in this context is the bigger picture thinking and more of the vision around where you want to go. So do you want to plan for growth? You know, do you want to target specific populations, content, shared materials, synchronous, asynchronous? So let's further break these down and chat about them in just a little more detail. When we're talking about growth in target groups and strategizing for virtual delivery, I think one of the obvious questions is, do you want to increase the virtual learning opportunities you're providing? Do you want to scale it back when more face-to-face is available? So that's a question for the organization. Another question is, do you see virtual learning as being an innovative strategy? And probably it should be seen as an innovative strategy because it's kind of new and different for most LBS programs. And how does that figure into your strategic planning or your larger vision for the organization? Do you want to target your existing learners for your virtual delivery? Would you like to consider a new profile of learner? Have you thought over, or have you recognized during this last couple of years that there's a group of learners out there who you really would like to target more specifically? Maybe it's the ones who can come after hours. Maybe it's the ones who do shift work. Maybe it's a certain demographic of underrepresented individuals who you would like to target. So those are some of the larger picture strategy pieces. And then obviously you need to think about what is it you do want to put online. I'm sure we've all been giving that lots of thought in this quick shift to remote delivery. What does it make sense to have online in terms of content? How much, how long, in what format? Are there open educational resources that you can use so you don't have to develop everything? Can you share content with other organizations? Can you use eChannel as a resource? And as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So as well as some of the more strategic pieces, when we're talking about these content questions, those are very practical considerations. And then of course, what's your delivery strategy? So synchronous means that in some form you have live classes with your learners, whether it's once a week, whether it's once a day. But in terms of synchronous learning and synchronous delivery, it means you are engaging with them online at the same time in some form. Asynchronous, of course, is the opposite, where learners are in a completely self-directed format, and you provide the materials to them online, whether it's through an LMS or through other collaboration tools, and they are working in a self-directed way with instructor support specified through, whether it's through email, whether it's through virtual office hours, however you've decided to set that up. Or in many cases, you might be doing both, or you might consider doing both. Yes, Shannon. So the slides will be posted with the presentation, and any of the content of this section of slides does appear in the workbook. Right, exactly. Thanks for clarifying that, Heather. So strategizing around growth, target groups, the kind of content you want to place online. Do you want to package it into courses? How do you want to do that? What resources do you have to do that? And then what types of delivery do you want to engage in? So I've moved on to B, but just before I do you have any comments, questions, thoughts, pain points around any of these discussion points? I'll just pause for a moment there. So if you do have anything you'd like to type into the chat around any of these items, you have a moment to do that.
I was just going to make a comment about the delivery options.
Mm-hmm.
When you are planning for delivery, you may want to take into consideration that oftentimes planning for synchronous learning, may not be as onerous as planning for asynchronous. Asynchronous often needs to be planned well in advance, so that because it usually involves a learning management system and having curriculum available for independent study, whereas synchronous could, in a pinch be planned like a half an hour before if need be. So that's a consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. That's a very, very important comment and distinction. Because yes, when you think of asynchronous, you basically have to have all of the content, resources, evaluation for the course or the delivery package ready when you launch it. Because if students are moving through in a self-directed way, they may move quickly, they may move slowly. So and it's also it's more difficult to adjust things on the fly in asynchronous if you've already built this course that students are accessing independently. So yeah, very important point, Heather. Lee mentions delivered asynchronous without an LMS. Interestingly, some of our courses are on the LMS and some are not. Lee, do you want to unmute and just tell us a little bit about your asynchronous without using an LMS? We're jumping ahead a bit here, but I'd like to address the comment.
No, that's okay. Totally. Some of our courses are on our LMS, our science courses, and they're being delivered both synchronous and asynchronous. Well, one of them is a hybrid, really. But our other courses, like our math courses and our communication courses right now, when we pivoted, they weren't ready to be on an LMS. So what we've been doing is we have subject emails, and we have a schedule where faculty monitor, like are in class with air quotes, where there are times when they go in and they monitor the emails, reply to students, and if students want to meet up, they can do a WebEx with us. And so all of our learners are in it. It's self-paced learning, continuous intake. So learner A, like Joe, might get math for lesson 5, and Robert might get core math lesson 2, and we just would email the materials back and forth, ask them to email their work back to us, meet with them on WebEx. So if you need to or want to deliver an asynchronous, like a course that you already have and it's asynchronous, you want to do it asynchronous, sorry, not enough tea yet this morning, asynchronously, you can do it in that way. So if anybody wanted to ask more about that, you can actually feel free to reach out to me so I can post my email in the chat. We've also, to try and improve engagement, have set up an academic advisor kind of role where we have faculty assigned to certain students and they touch base with them and try to connect with them. And we're lucky enough to have cell phone, well, not cell phone access, but like phone access through the college system. So we can call our students on a college line and check in with them. So is that enough information?
Yeah, that's greatly. Thanks. And at least from Fleming College, just in case you're wondering.
I will post my email in the chat if anybody wanted more information. I'm happy to share with what we did.
All right. Thank you, Lee. Adam asked a question about authoring tools, and we will talk a little bit more about those in a subsequent section, Adam, but just in the meantime, if anybody wants to weigh in on that, feel free. Maybe we'll ask that question again when we get to it. So authoring tools are the applications used to create online content, particularly interactive online content. And there are a number of them. Sarah mentioned we're considering adding in some online students during class time with in-person students. Oh, that's interesting, Sarah. I would love to know how that works. So it brings me back to the early days of Contact North audio conferencing. I remember taking courses myself where I was sitting in a classroom in North Bay here at the college taking a PD course, and then through Contact North, we were audio conferencing in and even video conferencing with people remotely from other areas of Northern Ontario. So that brings me back to those days, Sarah. But now with the tools we have for collaboration, I think it would be probably better technology than we had way back in the early 90s to do that. And catch myself up in the chat here. So Tamara, it's really not augmented or virtual reality. It's just, it's tools to put content online that have options, many options built in for different formats, interactivity, quizzing, lots and lots of different options. And
Thanks,
they're not
Barb.
cheap.
Yeah,
they're-
I'm just a bit of a newbie when it comes to this stuff. So Adam sorted me out there and so did Heather. So I appreciate
Awesome. Okay. And some are easier to use than others, that's for sure. Okay, I see that as I'm scrolling down the chat. So we're all good on that now. Gary mentioned Alpha Plus is offering both with the educator network, including Moodle-based training. Yes, Alpha Plus has been trying to offer as much as possible in the way of those supports. Okay. And then a few more comments in the chat around some of the things that Alpha Plus is working on. So thank you for those comments. That's a good suggestion, Sue. And I think Alpha Plus has done some work around introducing some of these tools. But yeah, it might be a good thought for the coming year for those interested in a deeper dive into some of the authoring tools and how to access them and so on. All right, so I'm going to move along to our second subset. And we've kind of already just started to delve into it here. So that's great because we're all on the same page here, the same virtual page. So obviously, you know, we've already been discussing this. If you're going to deliver virtually, you have to decide what platform you're going to use. Would you like to have a learning management system? Are you comfortable and does a collaboration tool like Zoom or Teams provide what you need? Or do you need to go more in depth with a learning management system like Moodle or Blackboard or D2L or Canvas? Certainly document sharing, oops, I advanced a little too quickly there. Certainly document sharing is a consideration. We've already delved into the reliable hardware and software piece. And then what we haven't talked too much about yet is tech support. So let's again break these down into slightly more detailed categories. So you can obviously deliver virtually without the expense and maintenance of a learning management system like Blackboard or Moodle. If you want to be fully online like eChannel, you do have to have one. There's really it'd be very difficult to deliver fully online programming in the true sense of the word without an LMS. But because of the rise of collaboration tools in terms of both effectiveness and accessibility, I think we've experienced lots of good collaboration tools. I think of the very fast advances that Zoom made and also Microsoft Teams early in the pandemic. And those just happen to be the two that I'm most familiar with. I know many of you use Google Hangout, use Google Docs for document sharing. So there are many different options out there. Some may argue there's too many and it's hard to decide what to use. But, we have to think about not just the platform, but how will both our participants, our learners, and our staff access these platforms or tools or repositories for documents? To what extent do we need to offer training, again, whether it's to staff or learners? And we talked a little bit about that learning curve, especially for staff, practitioners, instructors, but certainly for learners too. It's not for everyone. Some people do not want to engage remotely, and some don't have the digital skills to do it unless maybe they come in face-to-face first and we help them with their digital skills, and then maybe they can embrace virtual learning a little bit. And of course, the C word, costs, comes into this significantly, because a lot of this technology, although some of it's free, not all of it is free. And it requires both financial resources and human resources. Devices and connectivity. We need to consider in virtual learning, like what's the minimum that our learners need? What's the minimum that our staff need to engage appropriately in the degree of virtual learning we want to offer? Can they use their phones? Is using a smartphone enough? Is using a tablet enough? Do they actually need a PC or a laptop for the type of programming and access that we need them to be able to engage in? And so the topics and the discussions and thoughts around devices and connectivity certainly are not just about learners. It's also about staff. And again, How much is this going to cost, and what do we have the capacity to offer? Tech support's a big one too, and we haven't really talked too much about that one. I think that many of us have become ad hoc tech support people, and many of us maybe have now got a little more sympathy for the help desks that we engage with in our organizations, if we have that, because the issue of tech support has been huge in our movement to remote delivery. Who offers it? When is it available? How is it accessed? Again, how much does it cost? Are you paying someone? Are you going to have to pay someone outside of your organization possibly to offer tech support? Are there people within your organization, to go back to the who are capable of doing more fulsome tech support? If you're offering synchronous learning, what are your parameters and timing for offering tech support? What about if you're offering asynchronous learning, when in fact your learners could likely access their coursework 24/7, 365? Do you want, or do you have the capability to support them 24/7, 365? Probably not. So planning for tech support alone is a consideration.
Oftentimes too, Barb, tech support consists of things like help videos and other resources of that kind that learners or practitioners can access independently. That doesn't involve waiting for a call from a tech support person.
Yes, absolutely. Creating some of those help videos and even an FAQ page that learners can access, if they can be a bit self-directed, absolutely. Super good options for tech support.
Yeah, and those all involve forward thinking, so kind of anticipating what the issues might be and what the questions might be, and planning to kind of circumvent them before they come to be an issue, so that they don't have to call tech support.
Yes. I'm going to put my e-channel provider hat on here for a second and say it is a never-ending journey to anticipate the tech support that's needed. And if you can, I'm sure many of you now could list a number of things around tech support that you've either already put in place or would like to put in place after this couple of years of remote delivery. So very much appreciate those comments as well, Heather. Very important to note some of those other options for more forward-thinking tech support. Once again, I feel my voice fading a bit more. I'm sure I don't have COVID. It's not in my household. We've had ran tests. Lee mentioned in the chat, Nicolette mentioned video links from YouTube. Yeah. Why create your own links? There are some incredibly good prepackaged things available on YouTube that one can link to for tech support for so many different things. So thank you for mentioning that, Nicolette. I think that's a really important point. And Sue mentioned that the ministry has allowed us to use training support dollars for digital devices and equipment. That's been a big windfall, Sue, I agree, for programs to have been able to transfer some of that training support money into digital supports. That was very well received. Lee mentions creating videos and paper docs for accessing our LMS and WebEx. Yeah, I remember you used WebEx as well. So yeah, you kind of came into this, Lee, with some awesome background that has obviously helped Fleming to move ahead. Nicolette mentioning issues with tech support for beginners are still needed. Yeah, many of those I have access to use terms I don't know and understand. That's a good point. Denise, our technologist, has been amazing. She has made many videos to help teachers and students. That's great, Denise, that she's had that. And maybe that's some of, sometimes those kinds of support videos are organizationally specific, but maybe that's something that can be shared as well, so people don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could probably do a whole webinar also just on tech support resources. Adam mentions Devlin Peck on YouTube is amazing. Yeah, I think I've seen a couple of his, Adam. I know I actually have an Adam that I look at on YouTube, and a Lara or Laura. Just some fantastic videos that have been created, that's for sure. Heather says, oftentimes we're aware of the supports that need to be in place, but they don't have the time to produce or resource them or the money. Absolutely. I have a long wish list of supports I'd love to be able to provide. And okay, you're getting a lot of support for a webinar on tech support. So we'll actually, all of us on the webinar today are part of the pop-up PD committee, all the facilitators today, Tamara, Sarah, Heather, and myself. So we'll take back that idea of a tech support webinar for our pop-up PD planning for the coming year, assuming the ministry funds that as a deliverable for us again. So again, just as a bit of a distinction between fully online versus virtual delivery, if you're going to be fully online, as I mentioned before, you really do have to have an LMS platform, because that's really the basis for all of your content and the basis for all of your interaction with your instructors and students. One not only has to consider, though, do you want to have an LMS and the costs associated with it? But just like any other software, there's regular upgrades that have to be completed, in whether it's in Moodle or Blackboard or D2L. And sometimes that can cause an interruption to your delivery. Sometimes a resource or a link will work well on the old version, but then there's an upgrade and then that link or resource doesn't work so well, or maybe there's a piece of functionality or navigation in your LMS that doesn't work well with the upgrades. So there's a lot of troubleshooting around upgrades that has to be planned for as well. Nicolette has a question. Okay, a comment there, focusing on one resource at a time. Sometimes the pop-up PDs are a little too fast to follow. Yeah, we do cram a lot of stuff into those pop-up PDs, Nicolette. I wouldn't argue that. So we'll keep that piece of advice in mind if we're able to go ahead with planning our webinars for next year. So Zoom is really more considered, in my opinion, a collaboration tool as opposed to an LMS, because although they've made many enhancements or improvements to Zoom, I believe it still rests more in the category of collaboration tool, but I could stand to be corrected if someone else has a different view or experience with Zoom. All right. So we talked a little bit earlier about authoring software. To go back to this slide. So if you're going to create content as opposed to just posting PDFs or posting documents in an LMS, you do need to use authoring software. And H5P is one of the more user-friendly ones, and there's many H5P free resources that you can use. Some of these others, Articulate, Rise, and Captivate, are produced by companies like Adobe, and they are really awesome. They do require generally quite specialized training to use them. And so that's where the next bullet comes in. If you're going to go big into authoring software, you really have to have instructional design and development expertise, whether it's on your own staff or whether you're contracting with an instructional designer or an instructional design firm outside of your organization. And talk about dollar signs, this is can get into some really big money. Yes, Adam comments about CAMs, and also the Storyline is very similar to PowerPoint. Yep, Storyline is a really nice authoring tool as well. So this brings us back a little bit to the distinction between virtual learning or remote learning versus online learning, where there is generally a level of interactivity through the use of authoring tools, for example. Okay, I think we're still up to date in the chat there. So moving on to the third of our fifth item today. We do need to consider maybe some different policies and processes for virtual delivery. That's probably a vast understatement, or a real statement of the obvious here. Because even though these little subheadings, these bullet points are considerations in face-to-face learning, they take on a different hue or context or level of importance, or a different level of importance in virtual learning. So let's delve into those a little bit in the next few minutes. A lot of people mentioned some challenges around communication with learners and with colleagues. So I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but if there's anything you want to add in the chat that you haven't already said about communication challenges with learners or colleagues, feel free to take a moment and type something in there. We've talked about that theme of just being harder to develop relationships through virtual and remote learning. Any more specific challenges you'd like to note? And again, I'll just pause for a second, stop talking and let you have a moment to type in if you'd like to type anything in. Google Meet fatigue. Yeah, online fatigue for sure. Heather mentions learners just want to do the work. They don't want to have ongoing discussion with you. Yeah, sometimes that's true. And sometimes the opposite is true, where they want to engage ongoing, but there isn't the capacity to do that sometimes virtually. Sarah, the reduction in personal chats does make it harder to help with referrals that may be needed. Yeah, we don't get to know our learners in the same way when we see them or engage with them virtually. So referrals can become harder. And just recognizing when they're having challenges. Sue mentions more students shared among colleagues. So for example, the Cambridge campus students attending Kitchener online programs. So this is speaking of Conestoga. So more communication is needed around learner plans, milestones, etc. Yeah, if you are a multi-site organization, communication across your sites in terms of virtual learning creates some different challenges. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll move on a little bit here. Feel free to still add anything in the chat. Tamara mentions in terms of a staff member, it's harder to connect, to be more cognizant of connecting with staff. Yes, underestimating how much we communicate informally. Oh yeah, I really second that, Tamara. Again, with the CSC is a virtual organization. We have been since 2013. So we have really had to work hard at our communicating with staff strategies, never mind with our learners in our e-channel program. Shannon, we have noted differences in work styles and learning differences of staff has been a challenge. Yeah, that's exacerbated when you're working remotely for sure. And yes, Nicolette, when you're a new staff member, that is kind of funny. There are people you may never have even met face-to-face or wouldn't recognize if you ran into them in the grocery store. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that, but yeah, if your organization has been bringing on new staff during the pandemic, you might not even really know what they look like or what they look like outside of their Zoom profile picture. So we waffled a little bit about this word code of conduct, but one thing I think it's fair to say that we experience, it's fair to say, one thing we do experience is in virtual and remote delivery and online delivery is that often people feel much less inhibited about what they will say online when they're not looking somebody in the eye across the desk or sitting on a chair beside you. So I think certainly there is a need for us as remote delivery organizations to manage the conduct of our learners deliberately and provide them with information about appropriate ways to communicate and help them to recognize that there is a human at the other end of their communication. And that might apply to email. It might apply to messaging within a learning management system or a collaboration tool like Zoom. It might refer to discussion forums. It might be in live classes. So that I feel like I can't emphasize this enough. I'm thinking of all of you out there who have probably experienced some challenges around communicating with learners. Just looking back at the chat. Yeah, Nicolette has a good point in there. So does Dina, in terms of trying to meet directly online. And I think we would all agree that trying to have a face-to-face interaction, a face-to-face online interaction is helpful. Some organizations probably don't have the capacity to do that with all of their learners just because of the huge numbers that some of us have in our targets. But if anything we can do to personalize the communication is really good. I just want to touch on attendance as well. Policies around attendance may be different if you have attendance policies for your programming and remote delivery, especially for asynchronous. If you're delivering asynchronously and students are in a self-directed format, are there timelines around how long they have to complete a module or a course? If you're delivering synchronously, is there a requirement for attending a certain number of live classes? So that's a policy piece to think about too. Thanks, Heather, for your comment. In the chat about the timing, yeah, I'll speed things up a bit here. And then academic integrity, academic honesty may or may not be a consideration for your organization. If you're delivering programming that is more academic, then certainly issues of academic honesty and integrity need to be hopefully prevented and addressed through some kind of a policy that your learners are aware of. So I'm talking about plagiarism and cheating and so on, which is much, of course, harder to monitor virtually. But there's also policies around that are needed around, our instructor and practitioner and staff response time. Is it still 24-hour response time? Is it 48 hours? Have you had to adjust that because of your remote delivery? Do you have guidelines for how fast things have to be marked and returned to students, guidelines or policies around what kind of things practitioners communicate back to students or don't, and some what kind of interventions might be needed? And then, of course, what are your policies around accommodations for virtual delivery? Are they the same as face-to-face? Is there additional software considerations that you might have to put in place if you're delivering virtually? Are there hardware considerations? And this goes back to some of the digital supports that we're trying to provide, digital devices and software and hardware, and how do we access them and how do we afford them and how do we give them, provide learners access to some of these accommodations that may or may not have been easier to do during face-to-face delivery. Can you provide documents in alternate formats? And that's something that we already do in face-to-face. I think alternate document formats isn't just a virtual learning issue. And then, do you provide scribes for students who have accommodations in that regard, or tutoring? So yes, maintaining milestone administration, as Sue comments, has been, maintaining the integrity in milestone administration has been a challenge. And rules for scribing, yes, they are important. And then finally, like anything that you might be engaging in a new format, it's important to strategize around, how do you measure success? How do you know if this is going well? Can you, discuss that within your organization? Can you get feedback from learners? But, it's often important not to bite off more than we can chew. If you identify a couple of small things you can improve on, wonderful. But as one of the ministry's favorite terms is that it's about continuous improvement. It's not about getting everything right at the beginning. And again, to describe just a little bit more about fully online, there are quality standards that online programs generally have in place. And there's a really comprehensive document called Quality Matters that many online providers in I would say in North America and possibly outside of North America use as a guideline for quality standards. And Universal Instructional Design Principle, Universal Design for Learning. I keep calling it by its old name, which was Universal Instructional Design. The principles of UDL are important to consider, also important to consider face-to-face, but if you're not familiar with UDL as a concept, I've just added a little definition here. UDL, Universal Design for Learning, gives all students an equal opportunity to succeed. This approach to teaching and learning offers flexibility in the way students access material and show what they know. UDL also looks for different ways to keep students motivated. So it kind of goes back to some of our earlier work around learning styles and the fact that there is no one size fits all. And UDL is trying to help us address in a more formal way those many various needs and the need to present content and learning in different ways. Virtual delivery plan. This might not look much different than what you're doing already, but again, the context of doing virtual delivery may change or modify some of the approaches that you're using. Again, not new here. You've experienced the changes needed in some of these processes. And Sarah's just added in the chat that we do have a quick evaluation. So if you have to leave before the end, then please do take a moment and click on the link in the evaluation. We'll put it up again later. There are some pre-packaged learner readiness checklists out there. Some of you may have developed your own learner readiness checklist to help determine the readiness of your learners to engage virtually, to help identify some gaps you might need to help them fill or interventions you might need to provide around a number of these items. And this isn't an exhaustive list. One of the e-channel projects for this year has been to create kind of a learner readiness document or material around preparedness to engage in e-channel. So that's something that you'll be able to access when it's published a little bit later this year. And again, we've already all been doing these things, but what do they look like? What do your processes look like? And how do you document them for virtual delivery? And just like it's important to have them documented and available to all your staff in face-to-face delivery, it's equally important to tweak them and make sure that everybody is on board with the same approaches to these things consistently across your organization. And what kind of supports and tools might you need differently in virtual? Heather, I know you mentioned this point when we were going through the content. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Around the supports and tools?
Okay, I'm just trying to recall which point you're referring to.
Yeah,
So-
sorry to put you on the spot there. We just originally we listed this just as supports, and then we added the tools piece.
Oh, yeah. So, and again, that kind of goes back to the earlier discussion about, possible videos to help, orientation tools, how to use the LMS if you're using one, how to navigate those kinds of tools.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. And I am going to speed things up here because we have about 15 minutes left and we'd still like to get through a few more topics. So again, your virtual delivery plan needs to talk or needs to address the communication strategies. How does that look different than when you are delivering face-to-face? Are you using some of these, all of these, none of these? Well, obviously you're using some of them, but how does that look in terms of your policies and processes internally? And then finally, just a little bit on staffing. And I think, again, many of us have experienced that there are perhaps different skill sets needed in our organizations when it comes to virtual delivery. And the concepts of recruiting, onboarding, and PD are not new concepts when it comes to virtual, but again, the context of them may be different. Linda, I see you have to leave, so thanks for coming today. Have a great day as well. And some of us might not be quite as far down this road. You know, have you had to create a new job description just to bring on people that have a skill set related more to virtual learning? Have you had to provide extra training to some of your folks who are currently, you know, your staff and or instructors and practitioners? Have you been able to provide them with paid release time for some of their PD? Does your organization have the funds to do that, to keep them up to date with some of the technology? And in terms of PD, are you going to, you know, do you have expertise internally to do some of that PD? Do you have to go to the sort of the outside of your organization to access some of it? So as we commented at the bottom, these are not so different from any other type of hiring, but the staffing needs may be, and skill sets might be affected by the needs of virtual delivery and the realities of virtual delivery. So let's talk about our checklist document now. This is actually an excerpt almost exactly from the introduction of the checklist. So we're introducing the checklist and workbook today as a resource. Nobody's bound to use it, but it's a resource that we'll make available after the webinar when it's posted. And we always just like to note that these are not materials that have been created by the ministry. So the ministry is not saying you must use these. These are adapted largely from this March 2021 webinar that I mentioned before, How to Ensure Success in Online Learning Programs, that was delivered by Darcy Hardy. And she, in that webinar, had an interesting checklist that we took and adapted for the purposes of this webinar and our documents. So any items in the checklist resource are intended to be guidelines for discussion and planning. So we have the checklist portion, which is literally a one-page checklist. And then we took each item in the checklist and expanded it a little bit to provide extra space to make notes if you did want to use that checklist or a piece of it for some of your planning purposes. And, this is kind of almost a nice summary comment at this point, because the extent to which you consider or apply any of the items that we've talked about today really will differ from organization to organization, and how much of your program you want to offer virtually. And of course, how many resources you have to devote to virtual delivery. So this is just a quick screenshot of the first part of the checklist. And you'll notice that these 5 items are exactly the same as our much earlier slide about the 5 subcategories we were talking about today. And then the workbook portion takes each one of those items and gives you a chance to delve into it just a little more deeply if you wish to do so. So again, this is just a little screenshot of a portion of the workbook. It is in Microsoft Word, so you can print it out and write in it. You can also type into it. And Heather was noting that we will make it available after the PowerPoint, after the presentation, when the resource page for this webinar series is posted. So finally, and thanks, Jill, for that feedback. We hope it's a good set of questions. So finally, let's just close out one of our last topic here and revisit the concept of blended and shared learners for the last few minutes as a way to help support your program in delivering virtually. If you go on the eChannel website, you will find a number of different resource documents. And this particular one, I liked the way blending learning was described. It's from something called the Information Referral Guide for Ontario's eChannel programs, which was developed some years ago. Blended learning in LBS combines face-to-face learning in an on-site program and online learning through an eChannel program. So that's for the LBS purposes, that's the definition of blended learning. If you Google blended learning, you would see other definitions. The online portion may be done independently by the learner at an off-site location, such as their home or a library, or it may be done at the on-site program, either independently or with support from an on-site practitioner. I'm just going to look in the chat again. So Sue's mentioning the Learning Group's online student resource portal with links to access online resources. Thank you for posting that, Sue. That's great. There's some advantages if you wish to engage some of your learners in the blended learning model within each channel program. You both get to count toward your learners' served targets. You can share milestones and culminating tasks if both organizations contributed to the learning that supported the milestones and or the culminating tasks. Obviously, it gives more variety of content and courses to your learners, because remember, going back to the eChannel infographic, there are over 500 different courses available on eChannel. Some of them are a few hours long, some of them are several months long. So A to Z. There's also, of course, resources, supplemental resources available through blended learning. And as we've alluded to earlier, scheduling options are often more available through eChannel, although some of you have put some amazing scheduling options in place through your virtual delivery. Digital skills development, and just in general, offering a more diverse learning experience. And I think it's safe to say that in the current world, the more we can help our learners to diversify and have the ability to learn flexibly, is a win. And just briefly, before we wrap up, blended learning is the strategy. Shared learners is what we call the actual learners who are participating concurrently in both an eChannel program and a face-to-face LBS program. They each have to have a separate participant registration form. Each organization has to have a learner plan, a service plan, and CAMs, and it does generate follow-ups. And the last point's important. As an eChannel provider, again, I'll just wear that hat for a minute and say that we have some really strong referral protocols in place with some of our face-to-face programs where we've kind of had a long established or more recently established protocol for shared learners and how that works. So if you're interested in doing that with a particular eChannel organization, I think it's really worth the time to develop a referral protocol so that everybody is clear on the expectations and how much what needs to be documented and shared if you're going to work with shared learners. We would be remiss if we didn't then flip over here and acknowledge that there are challenges with the blended learning model between eChannel and face-to-face programs and the concept of shared learners. The whole notion of duplicating all of that documentation is challenging. There sometimes can be issues of ensuring learners are placed appropriately because they're not being reassessed normally when they're moving from or when they're in a blended learning situation. It takes time and effort if you're going to share milestones. It takes time and effort to coordinate these communication protocols. And then sadly, unfortunately for the learners, they will get exit and follow-up surveys generated from both programs. And if they happen to be also an employment services client, there's another set of exit and follow-up surveys. So if we had a bit more time, I think we might delve into other challenges that we haven't addressed here. But since we're getting very close to 11:30, I'm just going to leave it at that in terms of the challenges, but recognizing that, yeah, there are challenges. And as part of that, going back to the ministry's digital capacity enhancement strategy, we've already started to raise the fact that even though the ministry really wants to support blended learning and thinks it's a good idea, there are these challenges and others that make it a little bit different. Shannon, thanks also for that idea of a webinar topic. But to sum up, there is no shame in thinking that if you're engaging with an eChannel program in a format of blended learning, it's not a bad reflection on your organization. It's in fact a good reflection because you're capitalizing on resources that are already there without reinventing the wheel, and you're providing some more interesting and diverse options possibly for your learners. And this funny term, no body snatching, came from a webinar years ago that my late colleague Arlene Cronin delivered. Because when eChannel really first started to come out to the forefront a bit more, people were really concerned that the eChannel would take away learners from face-to-face, but that is not the case. If anything, it's enhanced face-to-face and provided this opportunity for both providers to get credits toward their learners served targets. Just flashing up the eChannel blended learning resources page here, if you are interested in looking at it at a later time. And it's pretty easy to find even through Google. And Contact North does a great job, especially with all of Sarah's guidance, at maintaining a really good eChannel website, both for the eChannel programs and for learners and practitioners. So big shout out to Contact North for their work in doing that. Quick recap, these are the topics we covered today. We're at 11:26, so I won't rehash too many of them, but this is where we started. This is the journey we went on today, and here we are now at our summary and our takeaways. So we hope what you can take away today is that, you know, just a couple, even one of these points may be a takeaway for you. Some of them you might be already quite aware of. Ongoing meaningful virtual delivery does require a commitment to organizational strategizing, planning, policy development, and resource allocation. That's not news to anybody, but we're just trying to articulate it in a way that makes sense and that allows you to walk away with some thoughts about that. You might find the checklist and workbook resources helpful in your planning. Third takeaway, LBS eChannel programs can support blended delivery. And in those 500 plus courses, you may just find something that you don't need to reinvent. And then finally, that yes, the ministry is supporting the LBS Digital Capacity Enhancement Project. So we will all be interested to stay tuned for more details around that. I think that Heather's going to pop the, or Heather or Sarah will pop the evaluation link back into the chat. We'd love to have your thoughts very, very quick. It will take you a maximum, I'd say about 2 minutes, maybe not even that. And as always, we'd love to have your feedback on today's session. So with that, I will, certainly I can stay online for a few more minutes if someone has other questions. And I see the link to the evaluations now back in the chat. So thank you. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for the incredible sharing that you have provided through the chat and through some of your comments. It's, we really do have strength in our LBS programming and more strength when we collaborate and share. So we hope that this topic of planning and collaboration, that we've kind of hit the mark today for providing you with some more thoughts around your plans for virtual delivery. Thanks to Sarah for her, as always, technical support, and thanks to my partner in crime today, Heather, for co-facilitating and monitoring the chat and being on standby in case my in case my internet went down. And of course, Tamara, who's our other partner in this deliverable. But most of all, thanks to you for attending and participating. Be safe.